Good day to all of those who are listening in from around the world. Welcome back to the Purdue CIB Distinguished Seminar Series. And indeed, we have another distinguished guest today, Dr. Jeremy Gibberd. So let me give a brief background about Dr. Gibberd and then hand it over to him to take us through the seminar for today. Dr. Gibberd coordinates CIB's working group W116 on smart and sustainable built environments. He's also an adjunct professor at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa and a member of the Multi-stakeholder Advisory Committee of UNEP's Sustainable Building and Construction Programs. Dr. Gibberd has undertaken a wide range of sustainable built environment projects with the CSIR, UNEP, UNICEF, UnHabitat, One Planet Network, the World Bank, the government and private sector organizations in Africa as well as Europe. Projects that include research and the development of policy, legislation, rating, tools, guidelines, training, urban neighborhoods, housing, university college, and school design and consultancy that investigates and implements smarter and more sustainable approaches. With that said, please welcome Dr. Jeremy Gibberd for his seminar. Jeremy, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm going to share my screen. If you can just let me know that that's working properly. So when I was asked to do this presentation, I thought that I would actually cover some of the recent projects that I've done, and also really some thoughts about trends and changes that are happening really around sustainability and also around kind of smart ways of doing things more efficiently, doing things more quickly. So the presentation is not, a highly rational, objective presentation. It's much more about a set of ideas and thoughts, and then some examples, particularly in relation to projects that have been working on. So I'm going to run through some of these ideas: sustainability, sufficiency, social systems, smart solutions, and then really finish off with a little bit of information around SASBE, which is the group that I coordinate with the CIB. So really, to kind of start off with, the first idea that I'm going to argue is that for a long time, we've thought about sustainability in the built environment as green buildings, as buildings where we need to think about impacts. And what I'm going to argue is that actually we need to think differently and think more about buildings as frameworks, as having the required capabilities and characteristics that enable people to live and work in a sustainable way. And I'm going to just show some slides that really kind of cover why I kind of see this as an important move. So coming back to only a couple of years ago, where we were in the middle of the COVID waves, and we saw this situation potentially is going on for a long time. But also what is interesting looking back at that is really what we can learn from that time not very long ago. And one of the major things that happened was literally almost overnight, there was a huge change in activity. So huge reductions in power consumption, industry activity, surface transport, aviation, really almost, in some cases, only about 20%, but in other cases, much, much higher, 80, 100%. So there's a very radical change in the way life went on. And what is interesting is to look really at the impacts of that. And one of the kind of clear impacts that happened is just in terms of pollution. So if we look on the right, there's a picture of China before lockdown, and then another picture to the right after lockdown. And you can see radical change in the amount of pollution that was experienced over many of the kind of major cities within the country. And if we then look at numbers and we look at carbon emissions, what we can also see is that the global daily carbon emissions dropped radically as a result of lockdown. So up to about 20% drop. And one of the things that's really important, I think, for anybody working with sustainability is it's very easy to get cynical, to get discouraged that change can't happen or can't happen quickly enough. And I think one of the really important things is to think about what happened over COVID and how we can learn from that in designing and operating much better built environments that will create the level of change that's required. And what's interesting post-COVID is that we now see the emergence of patterns that were established during COVID. So things like the 15-minute city, where people could walk and access pretty much all of their daily activities within 15 minutes. And that's an idea that now is really embedded in many cities. So a particular example is somewhere like Paris, that's made this really a kind of core principle of the way they're designing and developing places around Paris. The interesting thing is that there was a lot of science already, and it took something like COVID to push us to change. But if you look at this work by Jones and Kamen, you can see in terms of the detail, in terms of carbon emissions in different areas on the east coast of the States. The green shows very low carbon emissions per household, where the red shows very high carbon emissions. And really this issue of density, of accessibility, has been known, and it's something that really we need to kind of build on and make a cornerstone of any urban development, to make sure that we start establishing the patterns that will enable us to live and work far more sustainably. So it's not just about, you know, a bit of renewable energy, it's really about embedding different patterns. At the same time, what did also happen is that we can look at poverty reduction, and there was a very clear line downwards really up until COVID. So very steady decline in poverty rates. And then around 2019, when COVID hit, we lost literally 4 or 5 years of progress, and we've gone backwards in terms of poverty globally. And that's something that we also need to think about and understand in terms of how we design and operate built environments. And looking at this kind of more broadly, we can see really at a kind of higher level in terms of climate change, and also in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. It appears very clearly that we aren't going to achieve many of those targets. So there's very poor progress in terms of many aspects of climate change and Sustainable Development Goals. This particular diagram shows Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 along the top, and many African countries really along the side. And you can see pretty much most countries are on track to meet 1 or 2 at the most of all of those Sustainable Development Goals. So we really kind of need to start rethinking and scaling up change and thinking back about what we can use in terms of COVID to generate the type of change and the speed of change that's required. And that's something that the IPCC have already started doing. And it's interesting if you read through some of their reports, it's clear that they've started looking really at a societal transformation approach rather than just looking at carbon emission interventions in silos. So what this diagram shows is it shows business as usual, a very unsustainable Earth. And what they're suggesting is that we need to think about achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, much lower emissions, and that will lead us to a much more sustainable situation. So the thinking about a kind of broader, more integrated approach is coming through very strongly at the kind of IPCC level. And the way they present this is really as a set of pathways that countries or towns or communities can choose. And we can think about the routes and our technology choices in order to get to a climate resilient, sustainable future. And this idea of pathways, I'm going to come back to later, because it's a very useful set of ideas in terms of kind of making choices about pathways, and those pathways may be different in different countries and at different points along that journey. So I'll come back to this idea a little bit later. But what is also important is that to achieve a particular target, we need to quantify it. And something like sustainability has, in general, very broad, vague definitions. If you look at some of the UN definitions, they talk about a future and, future generations. So it's very difficult to tie down. And this particular diagram that I'm showing on the screen shows a particular definition of sustainability, which is quantified. And it's a very interesting one because it also encompasses the idea of some social and economic aspects as well as environmental aspects. So the way this works is that you have a y-axis where you have an ecological footprint, and there's a target of 1.8 global hectares. So that's your fair share of the productive surface of the Earth. And that you should be below that if you're going to claim as a country or a city or a building to be sustainable. What it also does is it shows along the x-axis the Human Development Index, which measures quality of life. So it measures things like education, health, purchasing price parity. And what it shows here is a target of 0.9. So you have to have a minimum quality of life in order to claim, again, that you're sustainable. So that gives you this gray rectangle where countries can show where can aim for. So if you're a developing country that has got very poor Human Development Index, you can move in that direction. If you're a highly developed country with very high ecological footprints, you can aim to move that down. So this immediately starts giving you ideas about development pathways that I talked about earlier. It also gives you a very useful quantified measure. And it says that if you can achieve these types of these patterns within this gray area, you can claim that you're sustainable. So it's a very useful measure. And what I then used is really this idea that we have a set of environmental ceilings, which relate to things like carbon emissions, water, etc., which we can't breach. So it's very important not to breach those ceilings. At the same time, the minimal social flaws. So there has to be reasonable quality of life. There has to be reasonable levels of employment, health, education, etc. And sustainability really is about navigating between these two components. So if we then take this to built environments, what we can say is built environments have to have the characteristics, have to have the capability that navigates, that enables this capability, sustainability, these living and working patterns that are sustainable to be achieved. So you define a sustainable built environment as having the capabilities that enable those sustainable living and working patterns. So having developed that theoretical framework, what you can then do is you can break that down and look at specific criteria in buildings. And that's one of the projects that I did a few years ago, which looked at the Sustainable Building Assessment tool. And the way this worked is that there were 15 criteria, 5 environmental, 5 economic, 5 social. So it combined a lot of the different environmental, social, and economic sustainability issues, and had specific criteria which you could then measure and were represented on a report, and you could rate buildings. So quite a simple tool, but much broader than many of the other tools that we see around. And the tool's been used fairly widely, particularly in developing countries. So one of the projects that we used it on was for a project being done by the ILO, International Labour Organization, in Zambia, where we did an assessment of existing housing. We found that many of the existing new build housing were largely based on Chinese and South African imported materials. So that's what's shown in the top screen. So very short life, lots of waste, huge embodied energy in terms of transportation, etc. And as a result of the assessment and the process of using the tool, we then developed pilot local buildings, compressed earth, a lot of timber, grown materials, etc., which changed the situation totally, so that basically about 95% of the value of that building directly supported the Zambian economy, created jobs, supported small enterprises, etc. So quite a useful way of really kind of integrating sustainability into the design and procurement of building materials in that particular case. The second tool that I developed looks at a wider scale, looks really at the kind of neighborhood level, and this is called the Built Environment Sustainability Tool. And you'll notice the criteria here tie in very closely to the ecological footprint. Those 4 tie into criteria that is used to develop ecological footprints, and then these criteria here are used largely for the Human Development Index. So the tool aims to measure the capability for sustainability in terms of those 2 areas. And the way the tool works is that you measure an existing neighborhood, which is represented in this column, and then you think about a set of interventions that you can use to improve the capability for sustainability in that neighborhood. And you can then remeasure a future neighborhood once these interventions are implemented. And so that gives you a proposed neighborhood. It's also shown as a spider diagram, and also as a trajectory, a development trajectory. So just to show that in a little bit more detail, what is useful about the tool is it enables you to test many different ideas. So solar water heaters, or microgrids, or waste, or increasing density can be put in these different columns, and then you can see the impact of that intervention in terms of the extent to which it improves the human development capability, and the ecological footprint capability. And ultimately, what you're aiming to do is to get to full capability for sustainability, which is this gray area again. So it borrows from that graph I showed earlier. And again, the tool's been used really for neighborhoods. And this particular project, we looked at a South African neighborhood, very typical suburban neighborhood, low density, and really kind of tested a whole range of different interventions to look at improvements, and came up with a kind of optimum mix of interventions which could be implemented over time to get to much better capability for sustainability. So this is something a community can do at a neighborhood level. It's something that they could do working with municipalities, etc., to plan and change, transform neighborhoods to become much more sustainable over time. And this last slide shows really the kind of move that's been happening over time, I think, from a purely environmental focus to a kind of broader focus. So the Sustainable Development Goals are shown here, and some of the well-known rating tools are shown along the top. And what this shows is that a lot of the conventional green building rating tools do not strongly support many SDGs. That's starting to change in some of the newer tools, for instance, some of the BREEAM, BRE tools, and very deliberately in the tools that I've worked on, that is a focus. And there's some gaps, but it supports the SDGs much more directly. So moving on, the next broad idea I want to talk about is, again, we have a tendency to look at efficiency. And I think that's starting to change, where we start needing to think about sufficiency, what's sufficient, and then the idea of self-sufficiency. So going back to the idea of the limited resources that we have in terms of Earth's surface, what is sufficient for us to have a reasonable quality of life? What is equitable globally between people in towns and globally? And then the idea of self-sufficiency, which we're seeing very strongly in kind of net zero approaches. And this is very clear in somewhere like South Africa, where you can get a site where maybe only 2 or 3 people live on a 1,000 square meter site with swimming pools, garages, and then literally over the road, you will get the same size site with 8, 9 families living in the same area. So very clearly, it's not a situation that can be carried on. Both of these neighborhoods have to change. That has to change where there's better quality of life. And this also has to change in terms of limiting the use of resources, and to make sure that there's much more, a stronger focus on sufficiency. So there's a project that I did to look at this, and broadly took a typical Southern African suburb with lots of freestanding houses, and said, how would you transform this to a much more sustainable neighborhood with higher densities, and a much more sufficient situation. And so there's a kind of building model that's mixed use, modular, very easy to change and to fit to changing demographics and needs within a particular area. What this project also did, which is interesting, is it looked not just at space, it also looked at the idea of services, and how you could use on-site service enterprises to create small enterprises, local employment, that would enable these buildings to be self-sufficient. And the advantage of this is, again, that you don't have to have this situation where people need to commute 4 hours. They can be very efficient developments, because everything is local, including employment, including a very diversified, resilient local economy with many service enterprises that are needed by people on an everyday basis, being literally within very close walking distance. And the affordability of this also works very well. So some of the papers that we cover the study shows there's a lot of potential really in this particular approach. So the next area that I want to talk about, that I think we tend to ignore, many of us are architects or engineers or quantity surveyors, and we like to focus really on the product. We like to focus on equipment, on buildings, and to a lesser degree on control. And if you look at performance and if you look at transformation, we leave the 40% potential largely ignored. So what I'm going to argue really in the next couple of slides is that we need to have a much more balanced approach. We need to think about technology and controls, but we need to think about behavior and how we affect, how we encourage more sustainable behaviors, how we make things very easy to do in terms of kind of sustainable habits. And I'll show a couple of slides of this. So recently, we looked at buildings. So this again is a typical suburban house in terms of water and energy. And what we found was by far the greatest reduction and savings that could be achieved were always to do with behavior. So in this particular case, you could reduce water consumption by about half very easily by changing behavior. And in this particular one, again, about 30% reduction in energy consumption. And this is mirrored very much in kind of global patterns and benchmarks, is that we have this 30 to 40% that's very easy to achieve, but we tend not to do it. And my argument really is that as researchers, we need much better research into thinking through behavior change and developing really sustainable habits. This is reflected a little bit in my work, which has been with schools, and part of the thinking behind it has been to empower the many managers of buildings. So for instance, school principals, people who run businesses, who are not built environment professionals. And what I think is needed is to give them very simple tools, very graphic tools, to enable them to understand energy and water consumption, and then simple technologies like rainwater harvesting, like controls, and to see the payback periods, and then to be able to implement many of these little changes that relate to behavior, relate to controls themselves, rather than wait for an energy audit and a built environment professional to come along. The last example that I wanted to show here is a very interesting project I did with a colleague at the University of Pretoria. And what we looked at is we looked at students and their ecological footprints over time. So the way this project worked was a student was asked to undertake an ecological footprint of a typical week, of their normal week at university. They then were asked to kind of reflect on the consumption and what they could do in terms of interventions and change, and define that themselves, and then follow that through in the following week, where they actually made those changes for again a full week. and then generate a new ecological footprint. And what we found, which was very interesting, was that there were huge differences. So you can see about a 60% drop in ecological footprints in this case, and in this case, and about 40 to 50% in this particular case. And what this shows is it shows how important behavior and reflection is. What it also showed was how the environment affected behavior and habits. So, for instance, using cars at night because of perceived danger was one of the factors that limited, people walking, for instance. So it's a very useful tool, really, to kind of start thinking about how do you embed more sustainable behaviors? How do we make environments that encourage, enhance people to live in much more sustainable ways? So it's quite an interesting project, and we're going to run this regularly over time to start looking at how, what are the implications for built environments, design and management. So the next area that I'm going to look at, again, I argued at the beginning that we tend to have this focus on design and then look at the environmental impacts. So we design a building and then say, okay, it's using too much energy, or it's using, creating too many impacts from the embodied energy aspect. And it's always difficult to work in that way. And we are very unlikely to achieve highly efficient sustainable buildings if we follow this route. And really my argument is that we should change the models that we use to generate design and generate new systems in urban areas. And I'm going to use the idea of a kind of circular economy approach to kind of illustrate how we can use natural systems and ideas from natural systems which are inherently sustainable to start generating much more sustainable built environments. And what is also quite interesting about the circular economy is that it's not just about waste and limiting consumption to finite resources. It's also very much around kind of building natural capital. And economic and social capital. So it ties in very much with the ideas that I talked about earlier when we looked at the SBAT and the BEST, is that we need to build capabilities within built environments. We need to build capabilities within organizations and within people to create the level of change that's required. And as an approach, it's very strongly supportive of the SDGs. So there's good research that shows this, and that's what this diagram shows here. So one of the very early things that I did when I started looking at this area was to say, how do we make this contextually appropriate to Africa? We've got very particular developmental issues in terms of job creation, etc., that we need to address. So I developed these principles for African circular built environments. The top four are kind of very much the general principles that you find globally. What I added on was very much the idea of kind of local small enterprises, creating local employment, and then the idea of kind of linking up and supporting circularity in other systems, so systems to do with food, to do with waste, etc. So I'll give some examples. This particular bit of work was presented at the World Circular Economy Forum, and it looked at new models for housing in urban areas within Africa. And it basically developed a high-density mixed-use building. So it had a structural frame with infill panels that could be bio-based local materials, very easy to change, to adapt, to respond to needs locally, and then had a range of facade elements, vertical, horizontal circulation elements that could also be easily changed, repaired, and kept in use much longer than conventional materials. What we also did was maximize the productivity of different areas. So looking at green roofs, urban agriculture, renewable energy systems in terms of generating energy and food for the building. This is another project which also just looks at the impact of a change a simple building can make. So this particular school building we developed in Kuruman, which is a very remote, hot town, a village, really in South Africa. And we used the process to create local economic impact through using compressed earth blocks, where we developed a lot of the materials and constructed the buildings largely using locally trained labor. What is really interesting about this project is that, and I pop back there every so often just to look at it, is the buildings are in very good condition, but also what that has done is really kind of transform the area around it. So a lot of the housing around it were originally shacks, so corrugated steel shacks, extremely uncomfortable in summer, which temperatures can reach above 40 degrees. And now you find that a lot of the skills have been transferred and used to build people's own houses. So all the buildings now, instead of being corrugated tin or waste materials, are these compressed, very comfortable houses. So it's really looking at the kind of impact of change that you can create from a project into a local area. The other example, really, in terms of kind of supporting circularity in other areas around the site, is the idea of kind of informal settlements. So this particular slide shows how many informal settlements have an incredible range of services. So individuals are providing all sorts of different services in that area. And again, one of the things we can do if we want more sustainable urban environments is to say, how can we support and make a lot of these services linked and far more circular in terms of the way we approach built environments, because these are people's livelihoods. This is what they live on. What is also quite fortunate for us is that in Southern Africa, we're starting to get policies and standards and procurement that support aspects of circularity. So there's local content standards, the kind of green jobs programs that start looking at kind of local content and local jobs in Southern Africa, in Zambia, for instance. So on the next slide, this next idea, I really want to say one of the things, again, as researchers, we tend to enjoy the complexities and the power of kind of new digital technologies. And my argument is that we need to understand these and we need to use these, but what we really need is we need to combine that with new business models. We need to develop new enterprises, new approaches that will embed some of the power of these technologies to create more sustainable urban environments, more sustainable living and working patterns. And so if we think about the technologies, again, many of you will know the power of some of these new technologies around sensors, microgrids, building information models, etc. But the power of a lot of those tools really comes when we use that to improve access and affordability of services. And we can achieve radically increased efficiencies. And we all know the examples of Airbnb, Uber, etc. And I think, again, this is an area where we need to do far more work. We need to kind of think far more creatively about what are the new business models that are going to create the sustainable built environment of the future. Right, I'm on the last few slides. So this is the kind of last broad idea that I'm going to talk about, and then I'll talk a little bit about SASBE. So again, we often like the idea of a solution. You know, this will solve all the problems. Renewable energy will solve all the problems. And actually, we keep finding that that's not the case. What I'm going to argue is that we actually need to think about a broad route, a pathway that can adapt and change and respond to local issues, local situations. So I'm really going to talk a little bit about this idea of an adaptive pathway. And it comes back to the pathway that I mentioned at the beginning. And so what are these pathways for built environments? What do they look like? And the first bit of work I did was to really look at adaptive pathways as they've been used to build resilience in places like the Netherlands in terms of flooding and water. And the way they work is that you have timeframes along the bottom, and then you define all the possible actions that you can take to respond to different situations over time. And some of these actions will work up to a point. Then there's a tipping point where they no longer work, and you have to change direction to another set of activities. So you can see on this diagram really a kind of pattern of different actions and timeframes. And you can then use that really to kind of define an optimum path. So an adaptive pathway that you can use to develop a particular area, or in the example I'm going to show you, a particular building. And what I have done is kind of really look at how we can use this methodology for buildings. I'm going to show you a quick example of this rather typical nondescript office building. Many aspects don't work. It's in a poor location. It's very poorly used, and the methodology follows these 8 steps. It describes the study area, looks at the problem, looks at possible actions. So you need to approach this fairly laterally, you know, in terms of all the different organizational and building design and adaptation possibilities, evaluate those actions, and then really look at how you can assemble a route through the different actions, get to a preferred pathway, look at contingency in case things change over time, and then you have a building adaptive pathway that you can work on with building management, with the owners of the building, with the occupiers of the building, and use that sometimes to make very difficult decisions. So it's a structured methodology to really deal with uncertainty, to deal with a difficult future in a structured, hopefully in a way that minimizes disruption, you know, in the future. So this particular example, this is the plan that we looked at. Many problems, very poorly used, escalating energy and water costs, very unreliable water and energy, major economic downturn, so huge financial issues also with maintaining that building. So very quickly, what we did was we looked at a whole set of different actions. What about converting the building to a co-living space? What about partnering with tenants, looking at energy efficiency measures, water efficiency, off-grid systems, off-grid water systems, and then really kind of looking at the tipping point in some of these areas and defining an optimum pathway in this area in order to get to a particular plan that could be discussed and developed with occupants and owners in order not to have a redundant, wasted piece of infrastructure. So the very last, I think my time's almost up. So the very last thing that I want to talk about is SASBE, which is the Smart and Sustainable Built Environment W116 group that I coordinate for the CIB. And if you're interested, please join or find out more. It has a range of activities. One of the activities is the SASBE seminar, where it's about 2 hours and researchers present their work and there's good discussion. We're running hopefully a architectural design competition for South Africa, with CIB's W96 Architectural Design and Management. And we'll have a series of lectures as part of that. Again, we'll be invited, we'll draw the invitations to that through in the wider CIB. We're planning a conference next year. We have these every 3 or 4 years, and I've had many SASBE conferences over time. There's a journal that you can publish in, and we're always interested in new members and people wanting to publish or present at SASBE seminars. So please get in touch if you're interested. And yeah, I hope you'll want to find out more, and you're welcome to contact me. So these are my contact details, and I'm going to hand back to Mark. I think there's a little bit of time for questions in case there are any. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, Dr. Gibberd. That was indeed a very thought-provoking seminar. I'm sure everybody is thinking that how some of these ideas could be implemented. And so looks like Katerina, you have a question. Please open your mic and ask.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. That was very interesting. I am looking at smart cities. I'm a researcher. I'm looking at smart cities and sustainable goals myself. And currently I'm looking into green buildings, and I know that you've done quite a good research on those. So I'm wondering what you think about green building certifications such as BREEAM and LEED and so on. Is the certification a necessity to achieve sustainability goals and smartness in cities? Or can we achieve those if buildings are not certified, but simply follow the standards, the green building standards in their construction process?
Okay, thank you. I think broadly, I have quite a strict definition of sustainability, which is really this idea that you have to live within the planet's resources, within the global resources, and you have to achieve minimum quality of life. And if you look at that definition, there are very clear implications in terms of what you can do. So my approach would always be, go back to first principles and test whatever policy or rating tool you have against those principles. And I think what you'll find is that there are aspects of those tools that are useful and relevant and helpful. And then you'll probably find that there are many aspects that aren't. And you have to do some additional work yourself to make sure that it is really sustainable. It isn't just something that's slightly better compared to another building. I hope that's clear. Does that help?
Yes, that's really interesting. I would tend to agree with you, to be honest. However, there's international guidance about smart cities and sustainability, which tell us that these are the guidelines we need to follow in our cities, in their smartening up. So I was interested to see what your take is, and I would kind of agree with you. But so thank you very much for your wonderful answer.
Okay, no, thank you. I mean, I think as researchers, it's really important to question the tools. And if you look at any tools, if you look at any definitions, they've changed over the years. So there's a good reason for that, is there are aspects that are not adequate. So that's where we're different. I'm talking about the kind of research community, is that you have to question and go back to kind of fundamental principles and look at the evidence and look at what we need to achieve and look at where we are and look at whether that particular criteria or standard is sufficient. And as soon as you do that very rigorously, I think you'll find quite a lot of these international tools and guidance fall short. And that's why it's an interesting research field. You know, that's why we have smart and sustainable built environments. The solutions aren't there. We've got to create them. We've got to be far more rigorous. And we need to question, you know, some of these little incremental changes that we're doing currently, which are, you know, in my opinion, wholly insufficient. You know, we're never going to achieve much more sustainable buildings, much more sustainable cities within the timeframes that we need to. So if you look at 2030 targets, we're going nowhere near achieving that. So as researchers, my argument would be is always test the guidance. And, you know, if it's sufficient, follow it. If it's insufficient, look at something else.
Thank you,
Brilliant.
Katrina,
Thank
for
you.
that question. I think Malcolm Weish, if I got that right, has a question. Malcolm, please open your mic and ask your question. We are not able to hear you. Sorry, Malcolm, we are not able to hear you. Anybody else, while Malcolm is working on that? Yes, I see your hand up. Yeah, sorry, Malcolm.
Malcolm.
Yeah, Iqbal. Go ahead and open your mic and ask your question, please. In the meantime, I'll see Malcolm's question. Iqbal, I saw Iqbal raise his hand. Yes, go ahead, Iqbal.
Okay. My question was back to the differences in the denser township landscape and the across the road, where we have bigger lots with basically higher lifestyle inflation. So I think, to me, I think I kind of have an idea of how we can improve sustainability on the side of the townships and the more denser, lower socioeconomic landscape. But I'd like to hear more about what can be done on the other side of the road. You know, does this entail basically, you know, curtailing lifestyle inflation? Yeah, I'd just like to know more about that.
I think one of the things in the methodology I talked about at the last idea is that you have to really learn from what you're trying to change. So we know where we need to go in terms of sustainability, but we also need to understand the existing patterns. And so where we're talking about informal settlements or townships, there's all sorts of patterns that sustain people, particularly the informal economy. So people make things, they sell things, they repair things, they recycle things. And many of those patterns, that very intricate pattern of relationships, is what sustains that township. And once you understand that, you can then build that and guide it, for instance, in a more circular approach. And so what you're trying to do is understand the patterns that create quality of life, create jobs, etc. But improve quality of life by improving, for instance, the buildings, ventilation, access to energy, daylighting, thermal environments, schools, all of those sorts of things. But so what I'm saying is that I think the two environments need to kind of move closer together. And you know, they're particularly in townships and informal settlements, they're incredibly efficient. If you look at the carbon footprints, for instance, of an informal settlement, but the quality of life is just far too low. So we don't want to lose the capabilities, the characteristics that you find in there, the beneficial characteristics, but at the same time, we need kind of much better, you know, quality of life. And that's why, you know, that higher density, mixed use, local, very diverse local economy model is something that, you know, I would argue would work.
Thank you for that question.
Do I still have time?
Well, go ahead if you have a quick question. Yeah, I was going to read Malcolm's question otherwise. Go ahead, please.
Thank you for the answer. I kind of get how we would, you know, increase quality of life on, you know, in the township landscape, but I would like to know how we would kind of bring the other side of the road, how we would bring it closer to sustainability. And because I think we have what we have is when people tend to make more money, they want to move to the other side of the road. And yeah.
A quick answer. I think the second model I showed shows how you could transform suburbia into a much more sufficient approach, where, you know, units are much smaller. There's local employment, diversified economy. So, and I think the issue of kind of very big houses is problematic, and that's why we've avoided it. You know, big flats, big apartments, big cars. But, you know, for the future, we have to deal with it, and we need to put that into rating tools. We need to put that into legislation, because, you know, built environments won't be sustainable until we address that properly. So thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Malcolm was trying to reach out and ask a question earlier, and it's in the chat. And what he's asking is that it has always been difficult to market sustainability from a QS perspective. And what are your thoughts on that? And if the models you presented look into that aspect as well?
I think what I've found, there's two answers to this. The first one just looks at modeling and doing the calculations. And certainly in South Africa, it's very easy to make the case for more sustainable buildings. We have load shedding at the moment, so we lose 4, maybe 6, maybe 8 hours a day of activity, of business, because the grid is down. We have water shortages in many areas. So suddenly we have to close schools because there isn't water at schools. So the argument is not just in terms of cost, it's also in terms of kind of business continuity and you know, just carrying on with life. And as soon as you add up internal rates of return for energy efficiency and even renewable energy against the current and projected costs of water, unreliable water supply, unreliable electricity supply, the argument becomes very easy. So that's a kind of quick answer for here. It's more difficult, I think, in perhaps other locations, but the economics is changing from day to day. You know, if you look at LED lights, if you look at renewable energy costs, tax incentives, a huge difference. That makes, for instance, again, in South Africa, it makes an enormous difference. The second part of your question is really this idea of kind of adaptive pathways. And what we tend to do, because as humans, what we tend to do is just carry on with existing situation. So we can see, a radical situation like COVID, totally changing the economics of office buildings. And it's patently obvious that they're unsustainable. You know, there's a huge waste of money tied up and capital tied up in these buildings. And we hope that somehow suddenly the office market is going to take, accelerate again. And it isn't happening, and it probably won't happen. And I think part of what we need to do is use methodologies, develop methodologies to make people think about different futures and address some of the problems and say, you won't suddenly get people signing up, to fill your 20,000 square meter office building. Start thinking about it and start thinking in a very structured way. And if you do that, you have a plan, and you are likely then, far more likely, I would argue, to have a successful building, a sustainable building in 1 or 2 years' time when you start implementing some of the changes, rather than being stuck with a building that's being used at 10%, is being poorly maintained, is basically going downhill.
Yeah, true, absolutely right. We have a question from Linda. Linda, I see your hand is raised. Please open your mic and ask question. Linda? Well, I'm not sure if Linda is still there, but anybody else? I'm trying to see if I can capture any raised hands.
Malcolm or Linda.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
Go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. My question is, why you were presenting, you mentioned something like when you showed the two models, and you were talking about making the other side where there is a high density sustainable, along within the presentation as well, I heard you mention that waste management is also part of the sustainability as in concern. Now, my question goes this way. If the part that is already built up and that is looking unsustainable as in bad, so how do you intend to improve it? Is it through regeneration, which definitely will generate waste and is already unsustainable, as in waste is unsustainable? Or how do you intend to achieve the upgrade?
It's a very good question. And it's I think one of the most difficult questions that's facing us. I think if you're starting from scratch and you've got an empty site in a good location in town, you can design now, a fantastically sustainable building, because we know how to do that. We have the technology, we've got the knowledge, techniques, etc. So the big question that you're asking, which I've tackled, but I think it's an ongoing question, is we've got all of this existing huge cities. The States is full of neighborhoods that are totally unsustainable, that are reliant on cars. Most cities, have this incredibly unsustainable urban development. So what do we do? Do we knock it all down and rebuild? Do we look at adapting and changing those areas? And I think my argument would be that's why we would use something like the BEST tool, because what we need to do is we need to kind of assess what's there. And if it's got potential, by trying out lots of different interventions to get to the capability for sustainability that's required, with the existing infrastructure, we work with the existing infrastructure. If it patently can't, then we need to use the kind of best technologies to reuse, recycle components, rebuild, but potentially there is a requirement for demolition and reusing materials. But the answer I'm giving is deliberately not a blanket answer. It says, look at your area, look at where you need to get to, then test, a whole range of different interventions. And if you get the right set that's fine. If you can't get to that, you may need some more radical transformation, which is some demolition, which you try and avoid. But and sometimes it's depopulation. If there may be parts of the city or parts or areas which are, we should abandon. And again, it's a difficult decision to make. But again, that's why some of the methodologies I'm talking about, like the building adaptive pathway methodology, it enables people who are very attached to a place potentially to think and make hard decisions because they see it's necessary. It's the only way to have a more sustainable future for themselves and, for the area.
Thank you, Linda, for that very interesting question. We're slightly running out of time. We're already about 20 minutes over our prescribed time. But let me exercise my privilege in asking the very last question, if you may. And this is a very complex area, very important yet very complex area. And you did mention about smart and sustainable built environment in the same term. So focusing on the industry 4.0 aspects, whereas also bringing in the industry 5.0 aspects, which is more human-centric, resilience, sustainable buildings. So in your thought, how do we make that behavior change happen, given that the definition of quality of life is different for different individuals and then in different parts of the world?
Okay, I think you've kind of got two questions in there, so I'll try and separate them a little bit. So I think the quality of life definition, we can bring it down quite simply to things like consumption and production, sustainable consumption production. So ecological footprint is very easy to use. It doesn't mean you have to be, a vegetarian, or it doesn't. We need to understand this cap, this envelope, and live within it. And it may be very different in China, it may be very different in India, and it might be very different in the States. But the really important thing is that we need to understand that, and then within that have a minimum. So quality of life has to be, reasonable education, reasonable health, and purchasing price parity, so that we have to have some income that we can do things. So that gives us the envelope that we can work in. And we don't need to define, I think, every last component of that, but we need to define the environmental impact implications for that. So we need to understand that. And so that part, I think, we can look at the patterns that someone's proposing in a different city or a different country, and we can measure that and say, yes, it's sustainable, or no, it isn't. But we don't prescribe exactly how they live or what they can do and what they can't do. But we can measure it. And I think you also gave me, I think, quite a useful handle, which is this idea of technology. And technology is incredibly effective at measuring and giving you the feedback. So if you're thinking about doing something, or you in terms of your lifestyle or work or whatever it is, the technology is there. This very responsive, interactive technology can tell you, what is that impact? What's the impact, in terms of ecological footprint, human development index, etc. So we use the tools, we use the technology for much better decision-making, evidence-based decision-making. So we no longer have the excuse that, we're doing poorly because we don't know. We do, right. We could get that on our phones. We can get that from computers and sensors. So thank you for that question. I think it usefully tied together two sets of ideas.
No, thank you very much. This is indeed a very interesting topic and a very interesting seminar. Looks like a lot of researchers around the world are focusing on this very important aspect. So indeed, thank you very much. And before we close the session, I just noticed that David Cass has put a message in the chat box talking about the tool that he has. David, do you want to just take 30 seconds?
Thank you, CIB, and we're working closely with CIB on intelligent buildings. So we developed a rating system with the Chinese Academy of Building Research in Shanghai who have a smart building evaluation tool, a standard, mostly for big buildings in urban centers, not some of the things that Jeremy showed. And so we'd like to share that and try it out. We've North Americanized it and made reference to the codes and standards that ASHRAE applies, and China are doing their thing. We're working with Paris on the Smart Building Alliance. So as Jeremy said, we have the technology that is measurable now, whether it's wireless sensors or things. And I'm an ambassador for CABA, the Continental Automated Building Association, that is doing research in these areas. So the BIQ is available for those that want to try it, building-iq.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much. If you like, you can send me that link as well, and we'll see if we can disseminate that.
Thank you.
So with that said, Dr. Gibberd, thank you very much indeed for that very excellent seminar. And I know that questions are coming in from all over, but I apologize that we have run out of time. But we will do more of this at a future time indeed. So please open your mic and give Dr. Gibberd a resounding applause, please. This is the virtual applause.
This is the disadvantage.
Yes.
Welcome to email me if there are any questions that we haven't answered. So thank you for all the questions and the attending.
Thank you very much. I look forward to seeing all of you next time.